The question is, do you agree that Scotland should be an independent country?
For me, the principle that we work best when we work together.
Well, they didn't.
Very serious.
The referendum. It seems to me that they're not dealing with the issues.
Hello, this is episode 55 of the Scottish Independence podcast. This is the first of two, which aren't interviews, but are speeches taken from here and there that I think provide a lot of good information for campaigners, but also just make for a very interesting listening. The speakers are Alistair Bruce, who's involved with Yes Kirkcaldy, Ross Ingerbergson, who's a media officer at the SNP, and Robin McAlpine and Lesley Riddoch. Just a little comment on Lesley Riddoch. How she deals with the heckler is magnificent. This all comes from an event in Kirkcaldy, which was a few weeks back. It's also thanks to Two Thumbs Fresh Production that I can put it out for you here as a podcast. I hope you enjoy it.
Okay, so welcome to St Brice Kirk for tonight's event. My name is Marie Penman and I'm a volunteer with Yes Scotland. We've organised this event because we figured that people still had a lot of questions to ask about the referendum that's happening next September. So rather than making it a political event, what we've done is we've invited along some speakers tonight who are going to give you their version of events and their side of the story. There'll be a chance at the end to ask questions, but the way it's going to work tonight is each of the speakers will talk for a fixed period of time, and then at the end we'll open the floor up to the audience and you can ask them anything you want. If you specifically want to target one of the speakers and direct a question at them, just tell me and we'll make sure they answer it for you. So, we've got a great lineup for you tonight. On the far side we have got Alistair Bruce. If you're from Kirkcaldy, the chances are you've seen Alistair dotting about because he's a well-known face in Kirkcaldy. He's a regular on the Yes campaign and he's going to share his thoughts on next year's referendum and explain why he's come round to voting yes when he used to be a Labour voter. Ross Ingerbergson is also Kirkcaldy born and bred, now lives in Edinburgh. He is now employed as the Head of Media and Communication for the SNP. He's going to talk a little bit about the media coverage of the campaign and also just talk about the scare stories and maybe a few of the falsities that are often reported in the press, maybe clear up some of those ones. On my left here is Robin McAlpine, and Robin is the director of the Reid Foundation, which is a think tank aimed at achieving social equality in Scotland. Robin's also the editor of the Scottish Left Review and previously worked as a press officer for George Robertson, who was then leader of the Scottish Labour Party. And he's going to talk about his hopes for Better Scotland. And finally, Lesley Riddoch is a journalist, author and broadcaster, and now author as well of her book Blossom, which was published quite recently. Excellent book, and I'm not just saying that because she's sitting here. I have read it and I can recommend it to you. Lesley is going to take a look at what it would take for Scotland to flourish, and she'll be doing a little bit of a presentation later on, and also she'll be signing copies of her book afterwards.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? That's a pity. Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to start by thanking Marie for her introduction, for organising this event and for the tireless work that she does for the Yes Scotland campaign in her own time. What I want to speak about tonight is my own personal political journey and my commitment to independence today. I haven't used internet research because I want this to be a tale of personal experiences and my own political beliefs. So any errors or historic inaccuracies are entirely my own. I was born in 1962 into a very different Scotland from the one that we live in today. The Scottish history was barely taught in schools. The Scots language was frowned upon. Westminster was the only game in town, and the only choice seemed to be between London Labour or London Conservative. My earliest political memories are the Upper Clyde shipbuilders, the miners' strikes of the early 1970s, the 3-day week, and an angry woman throwing a bottle of ink into the face of Edward Heath. And it wasn't Margaret Thatcher. And then my first sense of political grievance came in 1979 with the devolution referendum. I was not yet old enough to vote, but I felt the sense of anger that despite securing a majority for a yes vote in that referendum, we were denied devolution through the political jiggery-pokery at Westminster orchestrated by a Labour MP by the name of George Cunningham. 2 months later, Thatcher was elected for the first time, And in 1981, I did what I thought people did when they opposed the Tories. I joined the Labour Party. It was an association that didn't last particularly long. In 1983, Thatcher was re-elected with a thumping majority. And in 1984, I began my degree in politics and social policy at Newcastle University. And my first year, 84 to 85, coincided almost exactly with the miners' strike. And I wasn't just angry with the Tories because I was angry with the Labour leadership in London. And I left the Labour Party during that miners' strike because I felt that they were given little, if any, support as men were starved back to work. Perfectly viable coal mines were closed down for no good reason. Thousands of men thrown onto the scrap heap and entire communities virtually shut down. And it was in the 1987 general election that I suppose I had my eureka moment. And I don't know how it took so long because it doesn't require Archimedes to work out that in British general elections the votes of Scotland barely matter. Because in that general election we elected Labour MPs and sent them to Westminster by the coachload. And yet the next day we woke up to the realisation that we had a third Thatcher government with another thumping majority. So by the time I studied, at this time at Stirling University in 1990, I joined the Federation of Student Nationalists. Now I want to fast forward to the 1997 devolution referendum. There was two campaigns, just like there are now. There is now a Yes campaign and a No campaign. And I want to contrast them and compare them and see if there are any parallels today. Because the 1997 Yes campaign included people in all parties and people in no parties, people who embraced all of civic life in Scotland. It was a positive campaign putting the case for Scottish devolution and what it could do for us. On the other side, the No campaign almost exclusively Tory-led with a few of the other usual hangers-on. And I compare them to the Private Fraser in Dad's army, because all they could ever say was that if you vote yes in the devolution referendum in 1997, we're doomed. And luckily the Scottish people rejected that negativity in 1997, and I believe that they will reject it again in 2014. And the reconvening of the Scottish Parliament 2 years later, after a brief interregnum of 292 years, has certainly brought material benefits to Scotland already. The Labour-led executive of Henry McLeish deserves great credit for the policy of free personal care for the elderly. And the current government has carried that on. We have ensured free tuition for our students. There has been the abolition of prescription charges, abolition of road tolls, the freezing of the council tax, and of course the balancing of the budget, despite our Westminster grant being cut savagely. So if we're going to achieve all that under devolution, just think what we could achieve with the full powers of independence. Because whilst devolution is better than nothing, it isn't good enough. And neither is Devo Plus, Devo Max, or Devo an awful lot. Because still the power resides at Westminster, that same Parliament, over which we have little influence. Now, I want independence for so many reasons. And I want independence because I believe that the big decisions affecting Scotland, including the economy, social security, defence and foreign affairs, would be better taken by a government in Scotland and elected by the people who care most about Scotland, and that's the people that live and work here. And I believe in an independent Scotland because that would bring an end to the hideous situation that we face today, where a party with virtually no mandate to govern here can impose upon Scotland iniquities such as the poll tax and the bedroom tax. And I believe in an independent Scotland because I believe that in an energy-rich nation such as this, it is a scandal that many of our most vulnerable people can barely afford to heat their house. And I also believe that far from wishing to renew or replace the Trident nuclear missile system at hideous cost, and then dump them all close to our biggest city, the people of Scotland want to banish weapons of mass destruction forever. Now, I am a child of the NHS. I was born with the most severe form of a brittle bone disease called osteogenesis imperfecta. That's resulted in over 150 broken bones, long periods of hospitalisation and frequent episodes of orthopaedic surgery. And I believe that an independent Scotland is the best way, and it may even be the only way, to ensure that our precious and vital public services, such as Scottish Water and the Health Service, remain in the hands of the Scottish public. Now, I just want to bring my contribution to a close, and I want to quote from one of the most famous speeches ever made, even more famous than this one. And it was one with which I'm sure you will be familiar, made by John F. Kennedy, who was assassinated exactly 50 years ago this month in Dallas, Texas. And in it he said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." And to my mind, never have those words had more relevance than they do in Scotland today. Because on the 18th of September 2014, the people of Scotland will have a hitherto unprecedented opportunity to reclaim the nationhood that we lost so long ago. So let us be bold and be ambitious. And let us campaign to secure that yes vote for an independent Scotland in which we can create a better Scotland. Thank you very much.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, good. Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation to speak tonight, Marie. It's a great pleasure. My name's Ross Ingerbergson. I'm the Head of Communications for the SNP at Holyrood, as you've just heard. So I'm very much a behind-the-scenes guy, so I don't often get to speak in front of people, so it's a great honour. I grew up in Kirkcaldy. I don't live here now. I now live in Edinburgh, but I have to say, in my time living here, I would never in my life have imagined seeing so many people in a room considering the prospect of a yes vote for independence. I think it's incredibly exciting. I'm heavily involved on a daily basis at work with the referendum campaign, so I'm going to talk tonight a bit about my experiences, and I'm going to say why I think ultimately we will be successful next year in securing a yes vote. The main reason for that, I have to say, is I think there is only one side, as far as I can see, actually imagining a better Scotland. I just can't see the No campaign organising an event called Imagine a Better Scotland. So, however, I'm going to do my speech in kind of two parts tonight, because I think it's first important to give you the messages that we're trying to put out from the Yes campaign about why independence, or what independence means. And after I've done that, I'm going to talk a bit about what the No campaign are saying about what a yes vote means, and I'm going to leave it to you to decide which you think is more credible. So in terms of our messages, I think there are two key reasons why we need a yes vote. There's the economic case and there's the democratic case. Now, Alistair just actually outlined very well the democratic case. He's got more life experience than I do of all that, but I have to say it's all, I totally concur with it. The economic case, I think, is one of the underside. It's the key reasons, the key factors for people who are still thinking about voting yes is, can we afford to be independent? The answer to that is an emphatic yes, it absolutely is. And I think actually that a key achievement of the Yes campaign so far is that where no campaign politicians previously said that an independent Scotland would be like Bangladesh, would be like Greece, all these other things, now they're all queuing up to say, oh, of course Scotland can afford to be independent. That's because they actually can't argue with the facts. The facts are overwhelming. Now, I want to give you 3 key facts. I don't want to bamboozle everyone with stats, but there's 3 key reasons why we can afford to be independent. The first is that in each of the last 30 years, the amount of tax revenue generated per head in Scotland has been greater than the rest of the UK. In each of the last 30 years, the amount of tax revenue generated per head in Scotland has been greater than the rest of the UK. So in good times and in bad times, we've still generated more tax. A similar stat is that last year, we contributed 9.9% of the UK's tax revenues, but we only received 9.3% of UK spending. Okay? We contributed 9.9%, we received 9.3%. If we'd been independent last year, we would have had a relative surplus of £4.4 billion, which is a huge amount of money, frankly. And here's my third fact, before anyone thinks it's all just down to oil revenues, which is repeatedly what the No campaign say, even without oil, our GDP per head is virtually identical to that of the UK. Now, with oil, it actually becomes about 1/5 higher. So these are all stats that nobody disputes. And as I say, they've had to accept on the other side that, yes, we would be better off if we were independent. So very briefly, I think it's useful just to outline why we're such a strong economy, because it's not all just about oil, which is what you hear. Of course, we are the EU's oil capital. We actually are responsible for about 64% of the EU's oil production, which is a huge amount. And of course, we've been getting told since the 1970s that it's about to run out, but clearly that's not happening, because investment is currently at its highest level in 30 years. As I say, it's not just oil. We are the renewables capital of the EU. We actually have 25% of the EU's offshore wind and tidal resource. Think about that, a quarter of the EU's offshore wind and tidal resource potential, as well as 10% of the EU's wave resource potential. These are future industries which, the UK as well as the EU, they need this renewable technology, so we're very important to them. We have a food and drink industry with a turnover of £12 billion a year, and I gather that we actually export 40 bottles of whisky every second, and we're actually the world's third largest salmon producer. And obviously we have a tourism industry which is thriving. Lonely Planet magazine said that we're the number 3 place to visit in 2014, which is quite exciting. We've got more universities in the world top 200 per head of population than any other nation on earth. I mean, I could literally go on all night, because I haven't even talked about the creative industries, the financial services industry, the computer games industry, life sciences. But the central point for all of this is don't let anybody ever tell you that Scotland doesn't have what it takes to be an independent country. We're one of the wealthiest countries in the world. OK, so why do we need independence then? I think you actually had a very articulate case for it there. The central message we tried to get across is the democratic case, that it's fundamentally better for all of us if the decisions about Scotland are taken by those who care about Scotland most. That is the people living in Scotland. Now, as you just heard, we do have some independence, which was given to us by devolution, though we do have decision-making powers over health and education, and that has allowed us to lead the way on many things such as free personal care and the smoking ban, etc. But unfortunately, we're still subject to some very bad decisions from Westminster, such as the bedroom tax and the steady dismantling of the welfare state, which I just don't think any government of any hue in an independent Scotland would actually allow to happen. The logical next step, therefore, is that we get decision-making powers over our economy. Basically because we are a hugely wealthy country, as I've outlined, but we're actually the 4th most unequal society in the developed world. The 4th most unequal society in the developed world. I've talked about some of the energy potential we have. We're such a wealthy country in that respect, but a third of people in this country live in fuel poverty. So if we get independence, we can elect the governments we choose. We can produce an economic policy which is tailored to Scottish needs rather than the needs of London and the south east of England. We can build a fairer social security system. We can remove Trident from Scottish waters, as you've heard, and most importantly, actually, we can keep some of the public services in public hands which are currently being privatised, such as Royal Mail. So that's the positives for me. That's the economic case and the democratic case. Nothing I've actually said is particularly controversial, I don't think, and everything I've said is backed up by evidence, particularly the financial stats. What I want to do now is just compare what we're saying about a yes vote with what the no campaign are saying about a yes vote. And as I say, you can decide which one's is more credible. I'll just give a bit of my personal experience with some of the stories I've had to give answers to, frankly, some of these scare stories. But first I should say, actually, that they do actually call themselves Project Fear privately. One of them actually let slip to a newspaper a while back. This is what they call internally. And you're about to see why, frankly. Now, some of these do sound quite credible. The first was, apparently, an independent Scotland, we would straight away lose the AAA credit rating that we've enjoyed as part of the UK. That one kind of fell apart when the UK itself lost a AAA credit rating, not because of us, but because of the mismanagement of the economy going on down the road. And as you've just heard, we're actually a much financially stronger country than the UK. Then there was the claim that people in Scotland would have to pay international mobile phone roaming charges to call people in England. That also kind of fell apart straight away when it emerged the EU has just voted to abolish roaming charges well before we would actually become independent. Let's see. Another common one that we get is claims that we won't be able to watch EastEnders in an independent Scotland. For me, actually, that might be a plus point if that was true. Maybe for some other people, I don't know. But I mean, that one is just rubbish as well. I mean, has anybody? All I would say to people thinking about that is go and look at the schedule for RTE1 in Ireland. Okay, the main television channel there. That is full of BBC programmes. Okay, it would be no different in Scotland. Now you'll like this one. This is an actual newspaper headline from July. It says, "Vince Cable, I'm not scaremongering. Children's clothes will cost more in an independent Scotland." Right. Then there was claims that England would have no choice but to bomb Scottish airports in order to defend itself from attack if Scotland became independent. That's just wacky, that one. I don't understand. Then there were questions published by the Westminster Scottish Affairs Committee querying if people could still buy wine from the Sunday Times Wine Club or whether the school curriculum would include English. Now, I've been asked to respond to these stories. The journalists have come through these stories, right? And here's my personal favourite. Claims that the Westminster government would seize custody of the giant pandas at Edinburgh Zoo post-independence. Now, I think I speak for everybody here when I say they may take our lives, but they will never take our pandas, okay? So, as you can see, it's kind of getting ridiculous. The No campaign, there seems to be no coordination and very little thought. But interestingly, these stories are actually getting less and less coverage. An interesting comment from Ian McWhirter in the Sunday Herald last week, which I thought summed it up. He just looked at the previous week's scare stories, just in 1 week. He says, "So there you have it. Scotland would be an impoverished and defenceless country, infiltrated by Al-Qaeda, shunned by Europe, barred from England, forced into deep cuts in public services, and run by politicians who are economical with the truth." You know, he's just talking about 1 week. It completely sums it up. There's a vacuum of ideas, frankly, in the No campaign about what Scotland should look like in the future. And that's why they're resorting to these stories. Just finally, one or two of these stories, I think, sadly, do seem to have a bit of traction. So I thought it's useful maybe just to highlight a couple, just because obviously these ones, when you think about them, are just also absolute rubbish. One of these is that there would be border posts between Scotland and England if we were independent, and you'd have to use passports to get into England. Now, why would this be the case? You don't need a passport to get into Ireland, and you don't need a passport to get into anywhere in the common travel area. Like the Isle of Man, for example, that's not even the EU. So are they seriously saying that in the UK you could travel to Ireland without a passport, but they would insist you use a passport to get to Scotland? It's just madness. The common sense position with that one is simply that we would inherit the common travel area. It would carry on as before. It works for the rest of the UK, and it works for us. So why would we change it? I thought, interestingly, last week, here's a Tory MP for the south east of England. He was asked about this on TV last week, and he just said, pull the other one. Now, if a Tory MP from the south east of England could think that story is rubbish, and I'm sure everyone else can see through it. A similar one is that we would be thrown out of the EU. Now, this one is bonkers, frankly. If we vote for independence, apparently we'll be thrown out of the EU on day one. We'll be forced to the back of the queue, as somebody said, and all these other things. William Hague, Foreign Secretary, he repeated this week. Now, just think about this one. There are tens of thousands of EU citizens living in Scotland from other parts of the EU. What is going to happen to them? Are they apparently supposed to be expelled from Scotland while we renegotiate our membership, and then they all come back in afterwards? It's just madness. Again, the common sense reality is that after a yes vote, we'll simply have a chat with the EU and we'll talk about any sort of things that need to be ironed out, and it's fine, we'll carry on. You know, we've been a member of the EU for 40 years, so we already meet all the criteria. There's no issue there. And frankly, the only threat to Scotland's membership of the EU comes from the UK government's decision to try and hold a referendum on ripping us out of the EU in 2017. You know, that's what the real issue is. So in both these cases, basically, a little common sense says it's nonsense. So all I would ask is that you, for my sanity as a press officer, is that whenever you hear stories like this, just think, what's the common sense thing? What's the common sense answer? What is in everyone's interests? Because in so many cases, the UK government, they're saying one thing right now, such as with shipbuilding this week actually, but they would say something completely different after a yes vote, because we're still going to be pals with the rest of the UK. Ultimately, we have nothing to fear but Project Fear itself. So, in conclusion, I think people are going to vote, well, I'm certain people are going to vote yes next year, simply because the Yes campaign is the only campaign offering a positive vision for the future of Scotland. And I don't think it will not be achieved by what people do and don't read in the papers. I think it's far more important just to hear what your family and friends say and just kind of careful consideration of the arguments. So my final request to you is don't wake up on the 19th of September next year wishing you did more to secure a yes vote. The real debate, the central question that we all have to answer next year is who can be trusted to make the best decisions for Scotland? Our own Parliament here in Scotland, or a Westminster system which increasingly just doesn't represent the votes or values of the people who live and work here. So, you've got a couple more very interesting contributions tonight, but please, let's all leave tonight pledging just to stop just imagining a better Scotland, and let's pledge to win a yes vote so we can actually start building a better Scotland. Thank you very much.
Robin is the director of the Reid Foundation. Some of you, possibly the older ones in the audience, will remember Jimmy Reid as a great trade union leader from the 70s, sadly deceased, and the Reid Foundation was set up in his memory to try and achieve the things that he was aiming for in his lifetime. So without further ado, please welcome Robin McAlpine.
Yeah, can I just start by saying whoever invented the breakfast meeting deserves to be shot in the head. Breakfast is for a cup of tea and your cornflakes. And can I secondly say that I totally want to back what Ross said about not waking up on the 19th. For God's sakes, folks, stay up all night. What are you going to tell your grandwains? What did you do on the 18th? Oh, I was in bed with a cocoa by 10. This is the chance. This is the opportunity to remember every single minute of it. But mainly, I'm going to talk about imagining a better Scotland. Because I've spent my whole life imagining a better Scotland. And there's one thing I want to tell you, I can guarantee you, will mean we don't get it. And that's doing nothing. Because to be quite honest, in terms of a lot of the big issues, collectively in the UK, we've been doing nothing about it for my whole life. So, you've heard lots of these stats before, but they're really worth repeating. Fourth most unequal country in the world. Of advanced economies, Britain is the second lowest pay economy of the lot of them. We have the highest level of disabled poor in Europe. We have one of the lowest productivities of an advanced economy, one of the worst balance of trade. We're one of all the advanced economies of all the OECD countries, we are one of only two who saw a drop in industrial production over the 30 years. Other countries were hitting 50 and 100% increase in their industrial production over that time. And if you're a worker, it's worth bearing in mind the fact that if you rank every country of the EU 27 in order according to who's got the most industrial democracy at their work, we come 26. So the slogan should really be better together, brackets, than Lithuania. That's the only country in Europe who's got worse workers' rights than we have. These things are all linked. It goes like this. If you don't have a voice at your work, if you don't have strong trade unions, and if you allow an economic system in which people who work have no say and no control over their lives, you will get a low-pay economy. When you get a low-pay economy, you will get an unequal economy. When you get an unequal economy, you will get tax problems. Because if you don't have people earning money, if you have people living in poverty, they can't pay tax. If they can't pay tax, you have bad public services. So, let's just have a look at the size and the shape of this problem. In Scotland, let's imagine there's a decent salary. Let's call it a decent salary. You can live on it, you can feed your family, you can pay your taxes, you can participate in society, you can even shop. Let's say that salary is something like £25,000 to £35,000. In Scotland today, of everybody who's in work, only 1 in 5 people earn between £25,000 and £35,000. 3 out of 5 earn less than £25,000. And half of the people in work in Scotland now earn less than £21,000. Now, let's say it wasn't like that. Let's say we weren't rubbish, because you're going to find there's a bit of a common theme here. We are rubbish. We are not doing well. Let's say we weren't. And I'm not going to talk tonight about Nordic stuff because Lesley's coming on next and she's the real expert. But let's say that we had not a bigger GDP, not a richer country, but a country that simply distributed its wealth better. Let's say we had the kind of pay that they've got in a Nordic country and the number of people who are in employment that they've got in a Nordic country. We did this and we remodelled what it would mean for tax. Without touching tax rates, without shifting tax rates at all, simply by making the Scottish people richer, we would generate £4 billion of additional tax. £4 billion. And that, in the worst-case scenario, is what some people are saying might be the tax gap if everything goes really bad with North Sea oil. We just have to fix our economy. Our economy is dreadful. We have very little productive enterprise. We have almost no serious large-scale manufacturing left. Whenever we get some decent large-scale manufacturing, our economic strategies don't really care. And I'll give you the example. Anyone in here who's specs, goes out, likes a drink, might have good reason to be very grateful for the disposable contact lens. I have. It just saves so much bother when you come in, foot and about with your contact lenses after a couple of beers. The disposable contact lens is the world standard. It was invented in Scotland by a Scottish company using £300,000 of public money and £100,000 of the money of the guy that started the company. When that company was at its peak in Scotland, it was employing 1,000 people in good jobs making these disposable contact lenses which they exported all around the world. Now, today, there's a hell of a lot more jobs in it than that if you live in Vermont, because it was bought up in an equity takeover and we lost the company. Now, all of this is for one basic, simple reason. It all comes to the same thing. In my life, I'm 40, in my life in Britain, there has only ever been one dominant political philosophy, and it's a philosophy of conflict. If we take two people and put them in a room, whoever comes out alive is the only one that's got anything good to offer anybody. Now, that model applies to everything we do. You can do it in schools. They call it meritocracy. We'll decide what the measure of who's the best kid is. By the time you're 16, whoever won that game that we set will have the chances for the rest of their life. And if you lose that game that we set, you're screwed. It's a conflict model. It works with business. Who's the most powerful? Who's got the most capacity to shove us around, to bend the tax rules, to lobby the government to get beneficial treatment? Who's the strongest? It can be summed up roughly in the phrase, cherish the wealth creators. You must have heard that, the wealth creators. Don't we love the wealth creators? Because they're better than us. They're better than us, and we know they're better than us because they've got money. And money is the universal sign of being better, according to this philosophy. So if these people have got lots and lots of money, they must have done something good. They must be better. So we should let them run the country because they're better than us. And that, in a nutshell, is how the UK runs. It's how we do it. Compare and contrast. Norwegian Prime Minister, in the middle of what we call the financial crisis, what they call 2009, said, to build more, we must share more. Now, let's stop and think about this idea for a second, because I know this is a lot of economics, but let me give you a simple way to think about it. Let's say you were running a nursery school. You wanted to get stuff built. What would your strategy be? Let the biggest wain shove the other wains out the road and grab the Lego? Doesn't work. Why does it not work? Because the game becomes grabbing and hoarding Lego. You want to get stuff built? Share the Lego more evenly across the wains. Some of them will build wonderful things. Now that, in a very simple nutshell, is what we're trying to develop in the idea of commonweal politics. A politics which said you don't only get the best results by letting the most powerful dominate everything all the time. You get the best results if you find ways to share resource more evenly. Now, the statistics show this. You don't even have to go through the statistics. You know this in your head. You can think about this. You can think about these two nursery school classes, and you can think about what those classrooms look like. That first classroom looks like Britain now. A small number of people have grabbed everything, and it wouldn't even be so bad if they were doing something with it. But they're not. They're hoarding massive amounts of wealth at the very time when our economy needs a boost. And the second classroom, that's the one we could have. That's the Scotland we could build. And there's really only one message that I want people to get out of what I'm saying tonight, which is It can be better, and we know how. We know how to get there. Because, as I've shown again and again, to be worse would be damn hard if you're in Britain. To be worse at most of these things would involve you turning into a third world country. Now, that's the reality of where we are. So what do we do? How do we fix this? Because there are an awful lot of people who are talking about, can we afford it because of the oil? Can we afford it because... We shouldn't be thinking about yesterday and the tax receipts from yesterday or the economy of yesterday because it wasn't any good. We need to rebuild a decent economy in this country. And there are a number of ways that we can do it. First of all, we're going to have to get ourselves a decent industrial policy and stop believing that if we just sit back and again let the powerful dominate, somehow they'll fix the economy for us, because they won't. We need to start doing things. We need to start doing things like saying, if you want to build productive enterprise, and I should emphasise this here, when I say productive, that just means that you create value in the economy, that the work that you do creates value. The reality of much of the employment in Britain just now is that it doesn't create any value at all. So let's take retail. The value in retail is created by some poor lassie in a Chinese sweatshop who turns thread into cloth and cloth into push-up bras. That value is realised by putting all these things in a lorry and getting it driven to a container port, shipped over here and driven to depots. And it's realised by putting those products on the shelves and taking the money out of our pockets. No value created in the economy, lots of value sucked out of the economy, because every penny of that profit came from your pockets, and all you got back were a handful of low-paid jobs. So, you might have heard that regeneration through retail, regeneration through the service sector. Really? If retail cures poverty, why does it not do it in reality? Because we look, the second biggest retail destination in Britain is Glasgow, which is also the city with the highest volume of poverty. We need productive businesses that make things, that do things, that keep the value here, which create value. When you have value created in the country, suddenly your employees become worth paying because they're of value to you. They're not just stacking shelves, and they're not just shuffling things around. They are your asset, and that's what we need to build. We need to build a Scotland based on that asset. So patient finance, a national investment bank that helps people set up businesses and accepts that if you're going to create a productive business, you're not making a profit in 6 months. You might not be making a profit in 3 years. Good, let's be patient. Let's wait for that, and let's help people to build these businesses. Let's keep these businesses here, because we are one of only 3 countries in the whole European Union that does not have legislation which is about putting workers on the boards of companies. It's an incredibly important thing. In Denmark, 65% of every business with 500 employees or over gives over a third of the board of directors to employees. And what do you know? The productivity, the quality of those businesses is miles ahead of ours. Because what they create is a workforce where the workers and the employers are working together in a mutual enterprise, not in a conflict model where they're trying to fight each other down to lower wages. We do not need any more Grangemouths. We do not need any more businesses in which crushing the pay of the workers, keeping them as low pay as you can get away with, is the strategy for business. It's no good for any of us. It's not good for the country. It's not good for the economy. It's not good for public services. It's not good for you. So we need to build this economy, and there's lots of other things we can do. I won't go into any of those just now. And once we've got that economy, once we've got a productive economy with well-paid people, then we can do amazing things, genuinely wonderful things, like building on the welfare state that we've got. And can I just say that the universal welfare state is, to my mind, the greatest achievement that's ever been created by civilization. To say at a national level that we will take from each according to ability to pay and give to each according to need, and to banish the fear of illness, to banish the fear of the kind of poverty that leads you to death, to banish the fear that you're going to be safe and secure in your life, and to do that between us collectively as an agreement is an amazing thing. And this welfare state, our greatest achievement, genuinely is under threat. And all I hear is, how do we reform it? And by reform it, they mean cut it. So I say, how will we reform it? And by reform it, I mean build on it. We are again, in Europe, we are the country with just about the worst childcare provision. which is another reason why we've got a bad economy. This is a statistic I saw in the Financial Times, and I didn't believe it at first, but it is true. The difference between the participation of women in the Norwegian economy and the participation of women in the UK economy is worth more to Norway than its oil wealth. I know this is a startling statistic. If Norway was to lose all of the women in the labour force that we've lost, that would cost them more than all their oil reserves. A large part of that is because we have no infrastructure to help women get back into work properly, because we don't take childcare seriously, because, once again, somebody somewhere in Westminster decided that that wasn't really what we need to do. Well, it is what we need to do, and we need to do it now. We need to start building in this welfare state, because the welfare state creates the social cohesion that creates the country that we want to live in. We need to decentralise. It is an absolute disgrace that a town the size of Kirkcaldy, and while I never came from here, my right-hand woman at my work for 6 years was a Kirkcaldy woman, so I am a little bit scared coming up here. But she always gave me a sense of a town with a real sense of community. And you have no democratic right to make decisions about your community. You don't have your own town council. You can't, between you, if every single person in this town voted to put a plaque up on a wall, you wouldn't necessarily get it, because we don't have proper democracy. Now, this is the key thing, because in everything that was achieved in 1945, the Labour government, I mean, it was an amazing period. They did amazing things. And if they'd done one thing more, which was to take the decision-making processes and move it out of the hands of that group of the elite in London who continued to run the economy even after it was nationalised, they could have taken that decision-making process and spread it out. We wouldn't be where we are. We wouldn't have had that slow creep of recapture of the state by the people who are not us. But that's what happened. So as we do this, we need to redistribute power, because right now our battle is power against people. The power of corporations, the power of multinationals, the power of vested interests. And the only thing that can hold that to account is us. It's power versus us, power versus democracy. We've got to get those decisions back where we can keep an eye on them. And so forget any arguments that I've made here, well, don't, but forget any arguments I've made here suggesting that I'm only supporting independence purely on the basis that I am absolutely confident that we can start building a better economy and a better society. I would believe it to be the right thing to do anyway, because the closer we take our decisions to the people that they affect, and more importantly, the more that we help them keep those decisions to account, the better those decisions will be. Now, there's a whole load more to this idea of commonweal that we're developing. So we've got industrial democracy paper coming out, a welfare paper coming out. We've just put a paper out saying, oh dear God, let's take energy back into collective ownership. Cut your bills by 20%. It wouldn't cost us anything, and it would cut your bills by 20%, and all the profits of Scotland's energy would come back to Scotland, because we need to make better use of our own natural resources for us, not for some Chinese multinational sticking up wind turbines. But I guess the last point that I really want to make about this is to do with, so it's slightly technical, so bear with me for a second. You might have heard people talking about populism. The SNP government, there's things about which I would criticise it, but sure as hell not for keeping medicine free, keeping education free, and for keeping care for the elderly free. And yet this is called populism by some of those who would really like to see our society wound down. Of course, not for the first time, they don't understand the word. Populism is not a phrase, it's not a word that comes from the root popular. It's got nothing to do with popular. Populism comes from the root populace. It's a political doctrine which says to manage a big group of people, the easiest thing to do is to divide them in two bits, a big bit and a small bit. Then make the big bit hate the small bit. And as all that internal hating's going on, we can get on with running things as we want. Which is why, right now, in a period when our elite crashed our economy and left us, working people in Scotland, with massive debts lying on our back, they have got us blaming the poor. They have got us blaming the disabled, dear God. I spent a morning with a disabled group in Leith, and I came away in a state of shock. The treatment and the abuse that has been directed toward the disabled in this country. Never mind the immigrants who came to this country wanting to contribute. These are not the people that we should be hating. Because who's the people that we should be hating? Nobody. Enough now. The politics of hate has served us dreadfully. We are a society of people who may be right and who may be wrong. We may not all agree, but my God, we are one society and one community. And we need a politics that brings us back together again, that connects us again, that doesn't set one against the other, employee against employer, poor against rich, man against woman. We need a politics that brings us back together. We need to take our interests, all of our interests, and coincide them. Because, let's be honest, the Scottish business person has largely been screwed over as much as the Scottish taxpayer. They haven't had a good break out of Westminster politics either. So let's bring these agendas together and create a politics that unites. Because while I hate populist politics, there is nothing wrong with popular politics. There is nothing wrong with our politics communicating to people again. Those who run the show just now are quite happy that in between elections for 5 years we stay out the way. It's time we got back in the way again. And it's time we got back in the way by making politics popular and by talking about it again. And so, in doing this, I just want to tell you what we are calling the project, the Commonweal Project, how we're phrasing this now. Because we've got a strapline. I'll tell you right now. We've got a politics which you can best describe as me first. And we've got to change it. We need a politics which is all of us first. A change in the political landscape in this country which can change people's lives for real. Imagining a better Scotland has been fun for the last 40 years. We need to be realistic that for small steps, which is a one vote on one day, we can take the power to stop imagining it and start building it properly. Thanks.
There you go. Can you chaps see that all right? You're okay up there? Because there's cheap seats at the front. Right, okay. Well, thanks very much for the chance to speak tonight. And apologies if some of this kind of, in a way, repeats some of what Robin said. Robin, you could, if you want to go and sit down there, you'll end up with a craned neck. I'm concerned about people's necks, because I got a dodgy one myself. Probably everybody who has lived for some time in this country spends a lot of time trying to figure it out. And some of what Robin has said is kind of sitting under what I'm going to say. But I've spent a lot of time travelling to the Nordic countries, and perhaps not so much picking up bare statistics, but noticing the way people operate, the way they live their lives, and then asking, why is it that we seem to be unable to have that level of equality, of happiness, of expression, of just confidence? And some of it is certainly to do with the constitutional setup in Scotland, and some of it is not. Some of it is some issues we have to deal with, whatever happens next year at 2014, and some of it is stuff that we have just simply looked the other way from for too long, I think. And the question is, if we were to become independent, what sort of Scotland would we have? And at the moment, there's a strong danger that we become a kind of tartan England. As somebody who grew up in Northern Ireland was run pretty well direct rule from Westminster for decades. And without realising it, drank the Kool-Aid. Many of the presumptions of Westminster pretty well filtered through unquestioned in Northern Ireland. And to some degree, the same thing has happened here. Obviously, not completely. Scotland went into a union with its institutions intact. And that meant something quite different from Wales and Northern Ireland. We clearly have our own education system with its own outlook. We have our own legal system. You know all these things. But at the moment, where are we? I mean, Robin gave you some indicators. If you look at things like turnout, for example, at elections, we're on, for local government elections last year, we're on a whopping 38%. Whoa. Now, we think that's not too bad because the English are on 32%. And if you go through a lot of indicators like that, we think we're doing a little bit better. We're sharing the gutter. When it comes to normal, and I know Alex Salmond is fond of talking about a normal state of affairs is to be your own country. There are many normals that you could look at, and I'd like to look at some other ones. A normal European country, a small European country, is regularly getting 70% turnouts for all elections. particularly local ones. So the question is, why don't we pass muster in these degrees, and does it matter? It strikes me it does. The other option is we could be aiming higher. We could be looking to become a new Nordic democracy. Now that may sound a bit far-fetched. My family come from the far north of Scotland, from Caithness and Stroma, in fact, a small island off Caithness. So they take some persuading that they're actually Scottish sometimes because they're a bit thrown. But there's a different possibility out there. As somebody who went from Belfast to Wick in one day, one awful day, before the A9 was dualled, before the bridges over all the firths north of Inverness, that was one hell of a drive. It struck me that the north was not this frozen, infertile, barren landscape that we've been led to believe. It took going to the Nordic countries to realise that, in fact, we are part of the Nordic countries' fertile south, if you want to look at it that way. Which would you rather be? You know, part of the frozen north of Britain or part of the fertile south of the Nordics? It's not an either-or, but it's a way of adjusting your perspective. And that's been an interesting one for me. Scotland, it seems to me it is, the metaphor that's used in the book that I've just written, Blossom, is really looking at, if you like, at the kind of metaphor of a garden. And there are so many buds in Scotland. As somebody who came across the water at the age of 13, I already had my ideas formed by another country in some respects. And it always astonished me that certain things were not noticed in Scotland as being absolute jewels. And I would say tenements are one of them. But the other thing is blight. What is causing these buds that we have here not to flourish? And the blight is inequality, pretty well all the way down the line, and chronic disempowerment. Now, that's not relative to England. If you stay in the United Kingdom, you'll never notice it. The second you go to any better functioning, normal, social democracy, which is what Scotland is trying to become, I think, you begin to notice pretty quickly we're really not passing muster very well at all. Good. I'm glad you heckled me too, because I would have felt left out if you didn't. Would you like me to go on, because then I'll be able to explain why? No, because, well, I'll tell you what. Why don't, Sir, could I ask you something? Just, would you accept the will of the group here rather than mine? You do. You can accept the will of the. You can accept the will of the group or not. Would everybody here like to hear this, and then you can decide if it's crap? Right. Now, this is kind of a tale of two towns. As I said earlier, my mother comes from Wick, and this is another town, Hammerfest. It's the world's northernmost town, right at the tip of Norway. And actually, it's so cold in Hammerfest that the kids, for the crack, throw boiling water into the air and watch it turn to ice. These guys, you know, shouldn't be there. It's that cold. Anyway, in the 1900s, very similar towns. You can see there the pictures. You could swap them. They're almost identical. Wick was a massive herring port, and Hammerfest, well, pretty well every type of fish was traded there. But things changed in the fortunes of these two towns, and they say something really about where Scotland is today. Two big things happened in Hammerfest that probably couldn't have happened here. One was, in 1897, Hammerfest became the first town in Northern Europe to get street lighting. Now, you may think that's nae a biggie, but if you've ever been in the Arctic winter, which is 3 months of solid blackness, that really means something. And what they did was they put a small hydro on the river behind Hammerfest, and they managed to get 5 streetlights out of it. Whoa, 5 streetlights. They financed it by a tax on beer, which wasn't that popular with the fishermen, but still. And it was hunky-dory until it ground to a halt 1 year in. They discovered, in fact, all they'd had a problem with was no one had ever put this in so far north. It wasn't insulated properly. When they fixed it, it ran perfectly well, and everyone got lights. Now, the thing that's significant about this is that those people there, because Hammerfest has been a commune that runs itself, a council, that owns much of its own land, that raises its own tax, and that can touch its natural assets. It could decide to go and put a hydro on a river. It didn't have to ask a laird. It didn't have to pay the Crown Estates Commission. It didn't have to go through a kind of complete confidence-boosting mind jump to think that something like that could be done. They just tried it. And then when they tried it and it did that for them, they thought, hang on a minute, supposing we put that same turbine in the Kvalsund Straits. Now, these straits are quite narrow, but they're not a patch on the Pentland Firth. Nothing is. But it's still quite a nippy straits. They put that turbine in. They spent years perfecting the technology. They tested it, put it back in again. And that company is now Hammerfest Strom, the company whose turbines will power Islay as the world's first tidally powered island in hopefully 2015. And it should have been us. And that's what happens when you don't have access to your natural assets. It's not some dry abstraction. It's not some wafty kind of problem for people who just, are particularly attached to the soil. It's that your own ideas are impossible to have as a practical outlet. And in Scotland today, we should have had hydroelectricity almost a century before we had it. Thanks to Tom Johnson, it finally came in around the Highlands and during the war, but it took the war to force that change. And we still have a situation where 1,000 people own 60% of the private land in Scotland. And there is no country in the developed world with that level of concentrated land ownership. Now, we could have done something about that, and we haven't. So, do we care? Does it matter? And it does. Because some of the points that Robin was talking about, this question about where does industry come from, well, where can it come from if you can't even manage to produce the technology which can access the best tidal and marine resource in Northern Europe? We'll end up getting it from someone else. The other thing that was significant here is housing, which I always think is very overlooked in the story of a nation. After the war, in Finnmark, which is where Hammerfest is, the Germans burnt everything when they retreated in 1944. They were trying to make it impossible for the Red Army to get traction. There was 3 churches left in an area the size of Denmark. And yet the people went straight back to rebuild their lives. And Husbanken, which was a national housing bank, was set up with a principle or an outlook which speaks volumes about the way that the state regarded the capacity of its people. And what that was they basically gave people a bit of money to go away and build their own houses. And to this day, about 1/10 of Norwegian housing is self-built. And that doesn't mean that 1/10 of Norwegians are builders. It means folk work together to pool their skills in what's called dugnad, which is community self-help, to build their houses. Now that matters a lot because what it meant was people just got on with it, did their own thing and built their own houses. They were owners of them, they were active in their community and they had something that they could borrow on. If they went to live in cities, they clearly couldn't build their own tenements, but what they did was they became cooperative owners of flats within little housing co-ops. That may sound a bit obscure, but I'll show you in a minute how that matters. This is me pal, Inger Matheson, who's standing in front of the Kvalsund Strait with the successful turbine sitting behind it. That's Hammerfest, a pretty frisky little city now in the north of Norway. It has the world's northernmost liquid natural gas plant. It has the Hurtigruten passes through. It's quite a happening place. This, to me, is the face of an independent-minded, capable people who are regarded as having capacity by their government. These are wifeys on the left here. I stopped these 2 old ladies when they just wheeled down practically a 1-in-1 slope in the snow on these wooden sleighs. And all the old people, in fact, everybody has these wooden sleighs in the far north. Now, can you imagine in Scotland, the second there's snow, everybody's grounded, particularly older people. They don't even go out. But look at that woman there with the wee red glows in her cheeks there. That she is the face of what you want in a nation, which is someone who knows that she's capable of going out and taking care of herself, wouldn't dream of being penned up indoors, and is presumed to have the capacity to do that. My worry about Scotland is that constantly all forms of government have presumed us to be incapable, to have no capacity, to have stuff done for us, to have a sort of stand there till we fix you kind of approach. And if we try to get in and about, if we try to get involved in our lives, then it kind of messes everything up for the professionals because we've moved a bit. That's not the kind of society that produces independent-minded people. And for me, I would be happy to live with any outcome of an independent-minded set of people. This is what I think they've got. Just by the by, that's the huts that everybody goes off to at the weekend in the Nordic countries. Again, it's easy to have them because land prices are very low. You do see a relationship. When prices are low, people consume it a lot. It's cheap to drink and eat here, so we ate our wealth. It's cheap to have land there, so they have huts everywhere and go there for the weekend. There's Wick. Now, you know this could be small town practically anywhere in Scotland because Wick just atrophied. It no longer has port status as a town. It's run from Inverness, although there's been an attempt to kind of have a group of councillors that meet at least. But as Robin said, this is unusual across Europe. We are not normal. The normal thing is to have little councils of maybe about 14,000. And I'll say, when people talk about this, there's not many tears wept for the loss of perhaps the old days here, because we had parish councils about that size. But they were run by the great and the good. We have not known truly democratic, truly local structures in Scotland, and you dinna miss what you've never had. So at the moment, we're sitting on big, and there's a template of largeness, I think, in Scotland, which probably arises from the feudal sporting estates and the size of them, but we're now marking it with our democracy. It's supersized as well. We lose traction, we lose involvement, and that marks us out as very different. You can't see that very well at the top, but here's a good illustration. This is Scotland as it is at the moment, 32 councils. And the one on the right is how Scotland would be if we had the average number of European councils. Now that's a stunner, isn't it? That's the average, it's not the most. France is crazily local. They have communes of 79 people. You could have a kind of large family. In fact, you could get the 5 Flyers in and they could run the place. But, you know, that on the right is what we would look like if we were somewhere near normal. So it's worth thinking about. That's how not local we've become. That's what we've got. Our average council is 162,000. The Nordics keep getting picked on. The Germans are about the same. It's not just the Nordics that have this characteristic. And there's the thing. At the delivery level, you know, the area where you really know people, that's the average budget for a community council, 400 quid. That's the lowest budget in Europe for that delivery level of council. And some of you may say, well, do you know, so what? They're a bunch of gatekeepers, they don't do anything useful, whatever. Well, not surprising. There's no statutory functions for a community council, and there's not even a limit on the number of folk who can be elected. So it just creates no focus whatsoever, and it seems everybody's happy to leave it that way. Our turnout I mentioned earlier, but here's another thing. That's how many Scots stand for election, 1 in 2071. In Norway, where you've got those smaller councils and you know folk, is 1 in 80. So, you know, you or your family, you know people, you are who is elected. And that has all sorts of ramifications. You know, Russell Brand was going on about he doesn't vote because it just encourages them. I mean, some of that is about the way that parties have taken over, because if you don't know who you're voting for, and you can't possibly know who you're voting for in a council of 162,000 people, the only demarcation has got to be the party flag. In most other countries, folk are elected because they are the capable activists everybody knows is basically running the place single-handed. In Iceland, you can even write in who you'd like to have stand, even if they didn't stand. And if enough folk vote for them, they feel morally bound to take the job. Now, you know, it's a different way of looking at it. Now, I'd like just one important thing. This is not to beat ourselves up. This is to say this is not a good situation by European standards. And there's some reasons. In 1814, the Norwegians nearly got away, and they were part of Denmark. Denmark had gone to war on the wrong side with Napoleon. Napoleon lost. All his goodies were being shared out by the Allies. And for a wee minute, the Norwegians thought they could be an independent country. So they gathered, 112 guys were gathered by their prince in a place called Eidsvoll, and they wrote a constitution in 5 weeks. Because this was just in the wake of the French Revolution, it was probably one of the most radical constitutions ever written. But it had at the heart of it something that wasn't very radical. It said it would enfranchise all male, well, it was those days, all male landowners. Now, overnight in Norway, because of how many people owned land, 45% got the vote. The same legislation in 1832 in our Reform Bill gave 5% the vote. The story since then has been predictable. In Norway, the Danish elite, if you like, the professionals, had to win the confidence and the support of the peasants, or the folk that lived out and about. You couldn't win with half the population voting. You couldn't sit in an ivory tower and top-down manage anything. It couldn't be done. But in Britain, the kind of deals that were done were always done by the elites, because only 5% of folk were voting. And that matters. It characterises the kind of democracy that we've had. It's a kind of thin thing. It's a superficial thing to some degree, and it doesn't involve us enough. A couple of other points. Housing, I mentioned earlier. Some of you might recognise this beautiful painting by Averil Patton of a tenement in Glasgow. I was astonished coming across the water. It's terraced housing like Coronation Street in Belfast. And these tenements are great in that they have a tremendous density. It's found that people will only walk 5 minutes to public transport. If you've got tenemental cities, you've got 4 times more people walking 5 minutes. So you get much better use of every public service. Tenements had a terrible reputation because they were overcrowded. And it has to be said that predates the Union, and Scots did that to Scots. We had appalling overcrowding at one stage, something like 10 times worse than London, right up until 1951. So tenements got saddled with a bad name because of that overcrowding, and yet they are the ideal size and height for the density of a functioning city. And the proof is, when you go to any other European city, you see them. You'll have been to other European cities and thought, by God, this is like Glasgow, Edinburgh, whatever. And there is the Palamine's tenement in Oslo. It's not that different till you look at the back. Now, this is a kind of pretty crappy tenement in Edinburgh, and one not very unlike it in Copenhagen, except that because, if you remember earlier, all the Nordics tend to be cooperative owners of flats. There'll be a cooperative that owns a block. And what that means is that they have managed to shield themselves against big increases in the market because there's some control on prices. But more interestingly, they've retrofitted 2-person lifts onto the back close of every tenement. Now, that's smart because it means with an increasingly older population, older folk can live on any floor of the tenement. Now, I mean, that, if you'd love to think that could happen here, but with councils as cash-strapped as they are, in your dreams. But nobody in the Nordics expects to wait for a council because they, in their smaller units than that, have been saving and putting money away for just these practical purposes. They also have solar panels. They've had them for 10 years. They have back courts that aren't no man's lands. They're actually quite pleasant with not just the dunnies. So, you know, it's this question of once you crack things down to be smaller and to get away from what Robin described earlier, this us and them dynamic where the winner takes all, you begin to get meaningful society budding up and growing. Now, in the United Kingdom, our tenemental structures mean we're the only people who've got the chance to do this. We could have district heating in overnight, to build on the point made about energy. Again, that's been standard in other countries, where councils, like Sweden, has 91 local energy companies run by councils. That's what they regard municipal duties as being, supplying essential monopolies to their people. And it makes sense, because instead of having however many boilers there are as folk in this room, you have one boiler, albeit quite a lot of pipes, but you have one system, one thing to be fixed. And when you get a better energy supply, one change. And that's why so many of those countries have shifted to more sustainable forms of fuel, because they have one change to make. We didn't do it. Why didn't we do it? We had the same housing type, we had municipal councils. We weren't thinking small enough, and we weren't thinking cooperatively. Some people were. This is perhaps, I think, some of the bravest folk in Scotland. This is a housing cooperative called West Whittlesburn in Rutherglen. And then in the 1980s, these folk realised they were never going to get their houses fixed. They were living in high-rise blocks. The council got some money to fix some of the area, and it decided to spend it on East Whittlesburn because they were low-rise and easier to fix. So the West Whittlesburn folk realised they were going to be saddled with verandas that were falling to pieces, windows that were leaking, all the problems that came from those high-rise blocks that were flung up in a hurry for life. And because there was a Tory government at the time keen to manage to wrestle council housing away from councils, there was a moment where they could get in and argue to become cooperative owners of the housing. Now, just think about this for a minute. These were the poorest folk in Glasgow with the worst housing. And that probably means they were the poorest folk in Europe with the worst housing in Europe. And they had the confidence or the nerve or the something or the desperation to decide that they would take this into their own hands and manage it themselves when the council couldn't. Now, that takes courage. And Muriel Alcorn and Phil Welsh, who were two of the pioneers, went round trying to drum up support. They managed to get about 60% behind them, but they said that's not enough. They need to get 75%. About 6 months later, they got that and they went for it. And they've made some incredible changes. You may not think this sounds terribly salubrious, but there's 175 CCTV cameras in their flats. And what that means is there's no drug dealers. There's also 11 lives have been saved because they've spotted people having epileptic fits, old people falling, and they've made quite an intervention in people's lives. They have a 24-hour Janny control so that if old folk are feeling just anxious in the night, they can buzz and the Jannies will come up and speak to them. Now, that really matters too, because in an annual period, Scotland spent £2.5 billion, and this is extraordinary, admitting old folk to hospital who had no emergency condition. They were simply alone. They were anxious. They had maybe had a slight fall, and there was nobody there to do anything for them. And when you get something that's smaller like this, a cooperative that's 839 houses, flats in there, that's the right size to be able to manage your own folk. Because these guys were also smart enough to go to be a fully mutual cooperative, they actually managed to avoid the whole right to buy. And that could have been done by every housing association had they moved to that fully mutual status. That would have made a difference. But it wasn't really discussed or thought about because we don't do cooperatives. We have done council housing. And that's a different outlook we could have changed, and we can still change. And finally, the most important thing is got to be children. Again, it was mentioned earlier about the different situation and the huge contribution there is to women working in Norway, but the difference you can see is in the children. And the way it works is that the right to a kindergarten place, an affordable kindergarten place, resides in the child, not the mother. So what that means is, in Norway, for example, you don't pay more than £200 a month for a full-time nursery place. Now, if you think that's impressive, bear in mind that the Norwegian currency is about 2 to 3 times stronger than ours. So you're talking about 80 quid maximum. And what normally happens is the kids are outdoors. Again, some of you might have seen this. It comes as quite a surprise. You can see the kids are out in -18 or whatever. They have an everyone system, so regardless of if somebody's a bit richer than somebody else, there's wee zoot suits there for all the kids in the class, and there's the same suits for the adults, because it's usually us turning up that spoils the fun, because we're the gatekeepers, not the Waynes. But they also co-locate with farms. Now, can you imagine that here, with all the worry there is about health and safety? Because they think that actually the kids' immune systems are strengthened by having contact with animals rather than the opposite. The kids in this Meadows kindergarten, they go in and they feed the animals, they collect the eggs very carefully, wash them, and they go in the weekends and sell them in town to raise money for the kindergarten. They grow their own tomatoes, they make their own hay, and the one day there is nobody absent from the kindergarten is when a dead cow gets dissected. That is a big moment, and I was quite surprised about that and said, do you never get any parents sort of complaining or any kids sort of fainting or whatever? And they looked at me as if I was an absolute imbecile. And I felt like one. And they said, it's just interesting, isn't it? Well, yeah, it is. It is. But this is, again, what's born out of having direct contact with what's sensible and being able to get on with it. Here's what happened when somebody tried to do the same in Scotland, in Coatbridge. Some Norwegians actually tried to set up the same type of kindergarten, and the council first of all said that some paedophiles might come and watch the kids, so they had to put this wooden thing up round the kindergarten. And the long bench that they had, which is a characteristic of Norwegian kindergarten, is a long, long bench which encourages the sharing and all the stuff that makes these things work. This was deemed unsafe, because if a kid got on top of the bench and jumped onto its head, it could hurt itself. And this, to me, this also arises from the largeness of the way we work. Because you know yourself, if you are absent from your kids, you tend to be pernickety. You tend to be you're prescriptive. You're thinking, what if, what if, what if? If you're in there in the moment, you can make better judgments. But too often, the folk who are running things are not there because of the largeness of everything that we do. I was very involved with Egg, which was a very good example of a set of people who'd been told they were worth nothing. And that was true of every political party. Nobody helped them at a formal level at all. This is Keith Schellenberg in one of his many mansions. And on the right, some of the more recent people who have come to live on Egg, which has really had an extraordinary success story. But what it's proved to me is the same people who actually felt completely disempowered, who couldn't even complain about the kind of nonsense that was happening on the island for decades, have cheerfully changed to the kind of people who can plan, make very sane and cooperative decisions. The first house that was renovated by the Isle of Egg Building Company, which was done by all the men becoming part of a cooperative, so that the one guy who was a builder wouldn't get all the contracts and wouldn't be boycotted socially for having that done. That first house, there was a couple of options. There could be an old lady from the mainland who was an Egg native returning. There was two girls who were good friends. And there was one guy who had a farming job. And unusually for the allocations policy, the house went to the two lassies, who were friends, who live there still, who've got their own families. But it was those kind of intuitive decisions to just change the mix. Because in lots of these communities, it's girls that leave first. It's not men that leave depopulating areas. So when you've got that level of control, you can start to make clever decisions. This too is a shocker. Has anybody ever gone up the A9? You know when you go that past Pitlochry, past Blair Athol, and you start to rise up and up past Calvin, and you get to what looks like a sort of desert. Now, this is the final point I want to make, because I think this is so important. In the same way as I think we've been sold a bit of a pup about the general lack of capacity in the Scottish population, we've been sold one hell of a pup about the fertility of Scottish land. This is Ron Greer and Derek Pretzwell, who are two ecologists in Perthshire, and they decided to just prove that you could actually have these big green desert areas turn into something quite viable. 25 years ago, they managed to rent a bit of ground. They fenced it off so the sheep and deer couldn't get in. And they started planting lupins. Now, this is where I came in because lupins are my favourite plant, and everyone thought they were mad. They planted lupins and broom because that put nitrogen back into the soil, and the little trees that were growing up through it got shelter, and it raised the temperature just enough for them to grow. And actually, that had failed in every previous attempt. What they've managed to create there, you can only see a bit of it, is an incredible verdant woodland with wild raspberries and all sorts of it's a beautiful place. What they were going to go on, once they proved themselves, they were going to go on and buy 100,000 acres of Perthshire, supported by Scottish enterprise. And the deal was all about to happen when somebody noticed they had no academic qualifications. I mean, they'd only proved that they could do it by waiting for 20 years to actually show what could be done. But there was just this hesitation. Who were they? Why would you invest faith in people who'd only shown they could do something? And the deal foundered. At the same time, they had made another suggestion to a place that we all know now, which is the Rest and Be Thankful. And if their planting techniques had been used then, I'd guarantee we wouldn't be sitting watching landslides the whole time on that place. These guys are angry. Ron is an obsessive and quite difficult man these days, and he'd take that as a compliment. And it's no surprise. There are many, many people in Scotland like that today. People who have given their all. People who believed that we're all Jock Tamson's bairns. People who thought that a man's a man for all that in this society, and found that actually it's still who you know, it's still belonging to the establishment, and it's still a kind of tiny range that's exploited of our capacity. And that's just not good enough. I'm going to skip through that, because the ultimate disempowerment is experienced by people at the very lowest margins of society, at the poorest people. And the link between poverty and lack of opportunity is so rigid, it's just quite staggering. This shows you that 2.8% of babies are underweight in the 10% poorest areas. There's the 10% richest areas, is 1.1%. This tells you again about the number of crimes in these different neighbourhoods, the 10% richest, the 10% poorest. And each time they're dramatically different outcomes. This perhaps is the most shocking. You've heard of the Scottish effect, and this looks at why Scots everywhere, but particularly this was looking at Glasgow, and across all classes, are dying younger than their compatriots, if you like, their counterparts in the rest of the UK. And the Centre for Population Health made this comparison between Glasgow, Liverpool and Manchester in areas with equal levels of social deprivation. It may be hard to read the graph, but you see the blue line that's going through the middle. That's telling you where Liverpool and Manchester are at in each of the kind of causes of death that are in the columns. Grisly little graph, this one. On the left are the things that you might think were the reason that Scots do worse. Cancer, heart disease, these kind of things. And you'll see that actually in those respects we're not that different than Liverpool and Manchester. Where Glasgow pulls away is on suicide, violence, drug abuse and alcohol abuse. If you like, these are illnesses of hopelessness. These are social illnesses. And what does that arise from? To me, it arises from probably living with absolute certainty that your life chances probably won't change, and having no capacity whatsoever to do something about it yourself because of these large units that stop you having the capacity to be able to fix things yourself. And if we don't try to change these things, we'll continue to have people like Tommy Riley here, who set up the Drumchapel Men's Health Project in 1996, a brave thing to do in Drumchapel, where, surviving the estates then was a question of trying to look hard and just pass the pain down to vulnerable people smaller than you. That's the way it worked. Tommy decided to try not to do that. Some other guys joined him, and they set up a men's health centre. They got 1 year's funding. Some of you will be familiar with that one. And they managed to put together aromatherapy classes in Drumchapel. They had a waiting list. They had acupuncture for guys trying to kick smoking. And the biggest buy-in was cookery classes. They had an 18-week waiting list for that. And they were getting somewhere. They were changing themselves together. They were changing their lives. And then the money just ran out. The Greater Glasgow Health Board didn't renew the money. No explanation was given. Does it ever get given? Does it need to be given? And Tommy took it very badly. He, before this thing started, was the only guy who didn't drink. He became an alcoholic. It took me some time to find him when I was writing the book. I did finally find him through some of the other guys. At that stage, he had COPD, and he died 3 months ago. Now, Tommy is the Scottish effect. This is not nothing for people to have nowhere to put the energy that they're trying to give to their community. And if we don't crack Scotland down into small enough, dynamic communities so that we can begin to move forward, we won't realise the differences that our neighbours, who are independent countries, have managed to realise. Because it's not just being independent that's given them independent-mindedness. It's the chance every day to know through actions and through practical life moments that the people they're sitting amongst are a capable crew that you'd sail with anywhere. And I wonder, with many folk further this room, when they think of the question of independence, I don't think they're assessing the capacity of Alex Salmond necessarily and the SNP crew to run Scotland. They're assessing all of our capacity. Because after all, if we're going to do something, it's us we need to rely on. We're going to do the heavy lifting. And in a way, it would have been impressive if instead of trying to persuade us about the capacity of the government was trying to persuade us about our own capacity. Because that's the thing we doubt. That's the thing we haven't had the chance to demonstrate. And that's the bit, I think, that we need to fix. So thanks for listening.
Take any questions from the audience. We've got a roving mic here, and if you want to ask anyone a question to anyone specific on the panel, can you say who you want to talk to? Otherwise, you can just ask any question you want.
Great to see positive views of Scotland, and my business is Orchid. Our byline is to help you flourish, so we work with hundreds of people on self-help, self-empowerment. However, I also think you do need to invade, independence or not, some of your drives, some of your ideas. I thought this with Robin and Lesley, very interesting, very pertinent, but you do need to galvanise the Scottish Government. So that also needs to be done, as well as empowering people individually. Very much related to creation, I know you said about wealth creation, etc., but we need to still in this country, and part of our work, although it's with businesses, is also with young people. We've worked with people leaving universities, schools, with the boys in Polmont who've come from harrowing situations, but working with young people through a business in Edinburgh from charities this summer, it still is pitiful. We have far more to do to provide them with self-help, the resources, the jobs that they need. So that would come very high up on any discussion of the type of Scotland that we would want. And another area touched on was inequality in women. And so, yes, we need more power for our able women. Not just, oh, let's please Lord Davis and get some non-executive women on the boards, but right across the board. I gave evidence to the equal ops in the Parliament fairly recently, and from what other people said as well. Resources, women's talent, women's time, totally not being utilised, mainly because of, as has been mentioned, inadequate childcare. So we need to get moving on that. I have a bit of concern about everything's going to get moving after 2014 or 2018. We need actually to be doing it now. There are lots of devolved powers. There's lots that we can do individually on that. And also on the whole thing of what sort of Scotland do women want. Our rate of domestic violence is appalling. It's hardly Scotland the brave. And while it is a generational thing, takes longer, I feel we do need to address this. The problems of Scotland are the problems of many areas. We're a small country.
Can we just... I've got a question at the end of this.
Okay. So all I want to say is we're a small country. We can provide some of the solutions and we can be a beacon of light to the world again.
Okay,
that's my
thanks
bit.
for your input.
Thank you.
Thanks. Question for Robin, particularly reference to Commonweal. Now, we've got a very high rate of small business, medium-sized business failure in Scotland, but where businesses, very often, they're bought out by larger corporations and the wealth they generate goes elsewhere. Now, I'm particularly thinking of Germany, but also other northern European countries. They are much more successful at keeping a small and medium business sector in local hands, where the wealth these businesses generate stay in the community, and these businesses can then generate capital for further investment. They tend to do better with investment than we do. What could we do with independence to improve the health of the small and medium-sized business sector and stop them being bought up by larger overseas interests? Thanks.
I won't go through everything. Just a very quick list of some things that we ought to be doing. First of all, we've got to start using things such as support and finance. So if we're giving generous finance terms to small businesses, part of that might be golden share, encouraging them to stay. When I was talking about the importance of putting employees in boards, one of the key things about businesses which are run by employees, and it's interesting in the Nordic countries and particularly in Germany, the boards of big local companies have community representatives on the board. They are governed by their communities. And what happens is, if you have businesses that are governed by communities or by employees, they don't sell out. It's not in their interest to take short-term benefit and get rid of the businesses. Some simple things. One thing we've got to do immediately is change the situation whereby multinationals pay substantially less tax than indigenous Scottish businesses, because multinationals don't pay tax. We've got to crack down on tax evasion. Anyone that tells you that's difficult, they're not telling the truth. It is very easy to end tax evasion by multinational corporations immediately. And we've got to create a cultural change. In this country, we still get a bit obsessed with that Dragon's Den fetishism of how much can I sell my company for. That's a measure of how successful I was. We've got to get to the situation that they have in Germany, for example, where a successful business leader considers success to be how well they leave that company for the next generation to take on. So there's cultural and practical things that we can do. There's things that we can do to do with finance, and there's things that we can do with the tax system and the monetary system as well. One of the things which I think is important, and coming back to that point, is we've got to get away from the belief that there are simple answers. There is this belief, and one of the things I will be critical of the SNP is, if we just say cut corporation tax, somehow that will just lead to a flourishing. There is no single act that fixes everything. We need to use packages of things. The key thing is to understand what we're trying to achieve, and if this is the first generation of my lifetime that's talking about how we keep Scottish businesses in Scotland, by Scotland, for Scotland, that in itself will be a big step forward.
The gentleman there, Helen Shirley.
Could I just say something on the...
Yeah,
just a final wee thing on Germany. Where is it? Yeah, the thing about businesses. One thing, looking at from the historical context, after the war, the Brits were the ones who went over to Germany, thought that the concentration of power that had allowed Hitler to occur was something that shouldn't be allowed to happen in a new democratic country. And it was our guys who went in and created the federal structure, the very devolved structure that has meant Germany became an economic superpower. Only 18% of people in Germany bank with Deutsche Bank. So their model of banks isn't large either. And in the Nordic countries, there are Sparkassen, which are the smaller local banks. I think you're getting the theme here. Once you hand over power to one centralised authority, you're creating a recipe for the takeovers that Robin described. Now, I'm merely ponder that currently the Scottish Government is centralising many things. And it's true that actually in the Nordic countries there is also a single police force. But what they have right at the bottom is very, very local police forces in their little communa. And of course we don't have that. So what I'm suggesting is that when it comes to trying to protect, well, even trying to protect small and medium-sized business, just allowing things to thrive, allowing the energy that's there to come out, seems to work a lot better when you've got very locally controlled areas who, for example, do another thing. Labour it was who brought in the best value clause in a pernicious thing, actually, which has been very tightly interpreted by many councils. And it tends to mean that the lowest bid for any services will win every time, or if you're selling assets, it has to be the highest offer. And that is currently stopping communities being able to take over assets like the Murray Libraries, for example, because best value means they need to flog it off at more than that rate. And it tends to price local businesses out of being able to supply to councils, to hospitals, all these things, which is a nonsense. Now, there's been changes in procurement that should make things a bit better by the Scottish Government, but you still have this problem. That best value presumption needs to be taken out of our public life, or at least more craftily interpreted. And I think that would happen more if those council officials were eyeballing you every day and not their corporate lawyers. And what happens when you become remote and in an ivory tower is they don't see you. They never bump into you. They don't bump into the poor. They don't bump into you. They don't bump into anybody but the professional class who run things and never meet anybody else. And that's not to knock professionals. It would be hard to do anything else the way we're constructed. But if we don't think about the structure of our lives, we'll bump on like this forever.
Hi there. I've got a little bit of reading, should only take about 3 minutes. I've got 3 questions which all come under the umbrella of economy, money and financial reform. I did ask similar questions to John Swinney a couple of years back at the Adam Smith Centre, and I didn't get what I thought was a gratifying answer. So here goes. With an independent Scotland established, how do you see that Scottish Government addressing fundamental issue of issuing of money and changing monetary policy for the benefit of the majority? I'm talking specifically about the generation of money and its control. I'd like to just quote, "Let me issue and control a nation's money and I care not who writes the laws." At the moment, the majority of countries and their populations are experiencing the hardship of imposed austerity measures which appear to have risen out of the banking crisis of 2008. The issuing of money is presently done through private banks, for example, Bank of England, Federal Reserve, whereby we are charged interest. Is it possible for governments of this day to take back the right to print their own money? Will the new independent Scottish Government do this? If not, why not? Another quote. This House considers that the continued issue of all means of exchange, be they coin, banknotes or credit, by private firms as an interest-bearing debt against the public should cease forthwith. That sovereign power and duty of issuing money in all forms should be returned to the people and then put into circulation free of all debt and interest obligations. That was tabled as an early day motion in the Houses of Parliament. As I said earlier, I asked similar questions to John Swinney at a Q&A meeting at the Adam Smith Centre more than a year ago, and unfortunately his answer did not address any of my questions, and his reply to a further email I sent contained a copy of the Vickers report on banking reform, which was as difficult to digest as the small print on insurance policy. My final question, will an independent Scottish Government implement fully a present-day form of the Glass-Steagall Act, whereby commercial high street banks are clearly and absolutely prohibited from participating in the investment banking business? And the reason I mention this is what everybody's experiencing the consequence of this austerity package. So if we move into independence, which I am up for, what's going to be the Scottish Parliament's position on that? How are they going to manage that? Or are we just going to carry on with the system as it stands?
OK, it's late in the night for complex monetary policy. First of all, the first question that you're asking, I'm not going to say what we should do, I'm going to say what will happen once we're independent. Within 5 years, maybe 10 at an absolute outside, watching sterling, we're going to say this is not well managed. It's not well managed because we run it as a dirt cheap currency, which is really only good for financial speculation. It's difficult to explain this in a minute, so I won't. But it's just to say that the way that we manage our money favours those who want to use it for speculative gain, and it's very, very bad for those who want to use it for productive building of things. It would take about 5 years for that to dawn on us firmly. We will not retain sterling for long once we're in. We'll get to use sterling, but we won't retain it for long. In terms of what we do for debt things, we do have to be careful. Fiat currency, the printing of money, is a very, very powerful thing, but if you use it willy-nilly, it does cause problems. When I was saying earlier on that we want to be able to take energy back into collective ownership because it will take 20% off the energy bills, that's because if the way that the currency is managed is well regarded, borrowing costs are very low. So some of the debt write-off options and some of the things that you can do with a fiat currency harm other things that you would want to do. So there's a straightforward play-off between these things. And on the question of austerity, anyone who pretends that austerity is an accounting or a finance issue is telling you a lie. Austerity is politics. Austerity is the pure politics of saying the way that we are going to get us out the catastrophe that we created is to pass the burden on to ordinary people and take it away from people at the top, or from the big institutions, the big systems. That's what we've got to reverse.
Do you have any further questions from the audience? Gentleman down here.
Thanks very much. I was very struck by Lesley's story about Tommy Riley. I'll be voting yes, but I think we'd be sticking our head in the sand if we don't at least accept the risk that Scotland's going to vote no. What can be done to stop Scotland ending up like Tommy Riley after a no vote, ending up worse off than we are now in terms of confidence and such like?
Well, I don't think, I mean, it's hard to make that kind of parallel between a country and a man, although I suppose that's true. I don't think all the energy there is in this room, and I see all over the country, goes back in the box. I mean, something has changed about us. Robin's right, look. I mean, what is it now? It's kind of 9:30 on a Friday night. You're all largely still here, and most of you are awake. I mean, this is utterly unbelievable. I mean, people are now beginning to become expert in all sorts of things that you probably never thought you even wanted to know about. And that doesn't go nowhere. So, you know, that energy, I hope, will begin to make people to start questioning quite a number of things right beneath your noses. Because the things, to me, what would be great, and I spoke at a Yes Elgin meeting where they were talking about libraries. And I said, you know, why don't you take up Yes to libraries? I mean, why don't you just take over a library? Because what's happened is we've become infantilised by not being able to do things. I was in Linlithgow once and there was a meeting of the Chamber of Commerce and they were bemoaning the way Linlithgow High Street had dwindled. And one guy in particular was talking about a thing that maddened him, which was an underpass. And in it there was a light bulb that was always broken. And this just drove him crazy. And in the end I said to him, well, here's a thought. Why don't you take a light bulb and stick it in it? As in, fix it. And he looked at me for a minute like I was mad. And he said, but I couldn't do that. I said, listen to you. Listen to what we have become. And for a minute he thought, well, I suppose I could. And then he thought, no, they'd probably do me for attacking council property. And, you know, he could be right. But actually, personally, I don't care. I don't care anymore. It's the reason I left the BBC. It's the reason I've said I'll vote yes. Because it doesn't... You know, we have one life to live and who knows how long we're given. And I want to see change in my lifetime, by which I mean change of our capacity to work with one another and an awareness, that wonderful moment that I've been lucky to have in my life, where I've seen people in communities, West Whittlowburn, Tommy Riley, Egg, particularly Egg, where you wouldn't believe, the people wouldn't believe they had the capacity to run something, and their understanding of themselves was transformed. Now, that can only happen when you're able to do something practical. I'm a great believer in it. And that's not a big abstract principle. It needs things to be happening in your neck of the woods. And that is happening. There are development trusts who are running everything from libraries to little wind farms to bridges to pubs. There's food cooperatives being set up everywhere. There's transition towns. All of these are people beginning to take on some of the heavy lifting. But the danger is that what will happen is people will burn out. We are placing on people's shoulders all sorts of voluntary responsibility. Thank God for it. Otherwise, the likes of Marie, otherwise we wouldn't be here tonight. And that's great. It's a characteristic of Scotland that because our structures are wrong, our voluntary capacity is superb and will burn out. And what we should have is a society whose structures fit us. We shouldn't always be trying to fit ourselves to things that are like our great-grandfather's big coat that doesn't fit. We need things to fit our communities the way they are. And those people who are currently the valiant community activists holding the ceiling up would be the municipal councillors in any normal social democratic state. If that's not what we're going for, I'm not interested.
And can I just say, one of my favourite quotes of all time is Oliver Wendell Holmes, a man's mind, sorry for the gender, but a man's mind once stretched by a new idea never regains its original shape. This isn't going away. I'm one of few people who will stand up here and say, first of all, we are getting a no vote, a yes vote, and I can explain why there's not time just now, but political strategy is what I do, and I've been watching this a lot, and as soon as we get a couple of things right, talking to the Scottish Government here, we will win a yes vote. But if there was a no vote, I'm one of the few people who say it won't be 5 years before there's another. What we have revealed over the course of this campaign is a fundamental problem with our society, and believe me, more and more people are understanding and hearing this. If Scotland was daft enough to vote no, which it won't be, it would wake up on the 19th of September feeling dirty about itself and what it just did. There would be a change. The last time we made that mistake, we had a massive ideological battle with Thatcher. There would be some massive battle that would once again galvanise Scotland. And from my perspective, this is the point about Commonweal. Commonweal, you can do more with independence, but you can do a fair bit without it. And if that's what we've got, that's what we've got. We have to start to build a better Scotland either way. And if that is just to show people what they should have done and make them do it the next time, that's still what we do. We've got to do something now, and more of the same is not good enough, no matter what.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Gentleman over there, lad.
Thank you. I'm a wee bit concerned that after this yes vote, after devolution, we'll still be governed by politicians. And given the scenario that Lesley has drawn up for us, which indicates a completely different democratic structure from what we have now, would it not be worth our while focusing a wee bit on the Constitution? And does the panel think that that is a route whereby we can achieve that sort of structure that we all seem to be aspiring to?
A written constitution would be great, and it'll be very helpful and be a big step forward. But my day jobber was a political lobbyist, which means I know that politicians are never what you wish they were, but equally they're absolutely more than you often think they are. It's unfair just to say politicians get stuck in a system, and part of the problem is the system that they're stuck in. Our civil service kills a lot of what happens because it is a London-controlled civil service. We can change some of these things. However, I do share that concern. I just have never believed in the autopilot theory of politics. And that's one of my worries about how people are talking about the Constitution. Yes, we need one. Yes, we should have one. And yes, it can make a difference. But the simple truth is, countries do not run themselves. You do not reach a point where you can legislate or create the structures and press a button and go away and have a cup of tea. You have to get up every morning and work to try and achieve the things that you're talking about, and accept that that's the only way you can do it. You can write constitutions and you can create systems, but it's run by people. The key thing is, let's make it us, a big collective us for a change, rather than them. That's the model that we need to move to, and this decentralising model and some changes in practice can do that, and so can the Constitution. I just don't believe that we should put too much faith in a document. We should put a lot more faith in hard work.
I think there's a difficulty at the moment, because at the moment, if you were to take a snapshot of what people value, they do value big is beautiful. You know, there's a guy called Gert Hofstede, who's a sociologist, who did a kind of mapping of 52 nations of the world. I won't go into how he managed to do this, but through their attitudes, he classified them in different ways. This was about the 1980s. And he had the most feminine countries were the Nordics, and Britain was about 54 on that. It was a fairly masculine country. Now, by this he didn't mean women run things or men run things. He meant this. He meant that in feminine countries there was an interest in where the average was, and in masculine countries there was an interest in where the elite was. Now, you can readily understand that Britain is quite an elite country, because after all, we're all sporting superstars, aren't we? Because we won 12 Olympic medals last year, when we quite evidently ain't. What we need to get to is more of an understanding that it's where the average is that you need to shift, and that's what the Nordic nations intuitively get right. We're not there yet. This thinking about decentralising our lives is not popular. If I went out tomorrow and tried to stand on this platform for election, I'd get 2 votes if my mum was here. You know, you don't miss what you've never had. And in many circumstances, what's needed in a situation is not what seems readily apparent. We have become power junkies, so we want a big man standing up there telling us it'll all be okay. We want somebody standing at the middle who says, I can outwit everyone. We are in the big man territory. We always have had that tendency. Now, to go cold turkey in time to write a constitution, don't think it's going to happen. And if somebody wants to nail down exactly, which I think is probably a good idea, to nail down what's fair and a good structure for Scotland, it should be after a period of some fluidity where we have the chance to question, seriously question, what's I been? But that's hard. It's hard to imagine what you can't visualise. So I think the danger of trying to have something now is partly that it wouldn't give genuine weight to local. I'm trying all the time not to say localism, because David Cameron's got his damned hands on it. But too much has been tainted in the local field for it to be automatically something people would rush towards having. So that's one worry. And the other worry is that it would be run by professionals and probably a bunch of lawyers. Now, there may be some lawyers in the room, that's not to dig them up, but it's not their ball. You know, when it comes to how things should be done, again, there are inspirational examples. The Icelanders set up a constitutional convention of people who nominated themselves and were voted for online. And there was all sorts of people in there, including a couple of lawyers. I'd like to think we could move there, but equally, we are so hung up with status, we won't do that either. So if you want a constitution right now, I can tell you what you'll get. It's outside the door. It's what we've got. And what we've got isn't fit for purpose. So let's consider, this is not nothing to consider a new idea. What we do, we're grabby. Because we think the chance may never arrive again, we try to grab opportunities quickly and think, what can we get tomorrow? What can we do with this? How can we make it happen? We need to consider these changes this time, because grabbing has not got us the best answer. We need to really sort of start considering what a better society would look like. So soon, but not now, I'd say.
Is that okay? Yeah. Just to make this absolutely clear, I am voting for independence, and I will wrestle anybody to the ground who isn't. But I have a question for the communications guy, because I'm extremely worried about Salmon's relationship with Rupert Murdoch. So what can you tell me to reassure me about that? The relationship is far too cosy. No, I'm sorry, that won't do. That won't do. There's too much at stake. I'm very sorry. The second question that I'd like to ask is about our relationship, our potential relationship to the war machines of America and Britain. What will our relationship be to America and to Britain?
Ross, do you want to give a quick answer to?
I know. We don't have orders. We don't have orders. We can answer, we cannot answer, and that would just be the thing. I think that the SNP government has done a lot of wonderful things. I think there's a couple of unfortunate things. I think the sense of the Murdoch stuff was unfortunate and not helpful. Partially some of the Trump stuff as well. This is the nature of politics. These people spend lots and lots and lots and lots of money trying to make politicians beholden to them. We need to address that, and we shouldn't have people like, let's be clear about this. There's one way we can make sure that no Murdoch exists, and that's have the capacity to set our own press ownership rules. So my response to that is, let's not bash Salmond, let's bash Murdoch and make sure there isn't somebody there who can do that again. And in terms of the American war machine, the key thing to be is not part of Britain. That's the number one thing that you have to address if you want to get rid of the American defence establishment. We've got a paper coming out in a week or two, and it's not actually about defence, but it's about this idea of international relationships. This is another British thing. We don't really know what goes on. We still assume that everything is being operated on the power of large multilateral, multinational negotiations. What we're not really aware of is this actually broken down. The WTO, the capacity to manage the world behind closed doors by the US, ended. And the group who ended it were a collection of Latin American states who got themselves together under the name Mercosur and said, no, enough. We're not continuing like this. We're not going to allow US commercial interests to dictate international trade rules. One of the aftermath of that is that international relationships are largely, they've gone back to bilateral negotiation, which is actually a good thing. It's a positive thing if we can start to do this. So one of the things that I would say is not only get away from the chinless wonders of Whitehall, who believe fundamentally that the US is our future. So get away from them and then start to look for other partners. What could we do working with the Nordic countries? What could we do working with Mercosur? What could we do working with some emerging economies in Africa? What could we do to change global attitudes through creating our own relationships and not just trotting along behind big brothers, which is what we've been doing for our entire existence?
To dance our way out of our constriction. Gonna be freaking up and down the hang-up alleyway. With a groove I only got, we shall all be moved. Ready or not, here we come. Getting down on the one which we believe in. Can I get it on my good foot? Good God. By the time I get down one time, we're on the move. They can stop us now. Hey, don't tell me now. What you're talking for? Don't tell me now. Do you promise the funk? The whole funk, nothing but the funk. Ready or not, here we come. Getting down on the one which we believe in. My chance to dance my way out of my constriction. tell me now.
A chance to dance our way out of our constriction. Gonna be grooving up and down, hang up alleyway. Groove our only guide. We shall all be moved.
Beat don't fail me now.
Giving you more of what we're talking for. Feet don't fail me now. Here's my chance to dance my way out of my constriction. Don't fail me now. Do you promise to bump the whole bump, nothing but the bump? One nation under a groove, getting down just for the funk of it. One nation and we're on the move. Nothing can stop us now. One nation under a groove, getting down just for the funk of it. One nation, we're on the move. Nothing can stop us now. Do you promise to phone? Do you promise to phone? Ha! Do you promise to phone? Do you promise to phone? The whole phone. One nation under a groove, getting down just for the funk of it. One nation and we're on the move. Nothing can stop us now. One nation under a groove, getting down just for the funk of it. One nation and we're on the move. Nothing can stop us now. One nation under a groove. Here's my chance to dance my way out of my constriction. We're on the move. Nothing can stop us now. Do you promise to phone? The whole phone, nothing but the phone. You can't stop us now. Getting down just for the funk of it. Under one nation and we're on the move. Nothing can stop us now. One nation and we're on the move. One nation under a groove. Can't stop us now. Getting down just for the funk of it. One nation, we're on the move. Nothing can stop us now. One nation under a groove, getting down just for the funk of it. One nation and we're on the move. Nothing can stop us now. Nothing can stop us now. You can't stop us now.